Welcome to Group Talk, a monthly podcast conversation from the Small Group Network, focusing on topics relevant to small groups ministries. Whether you're in a church of 100 or 10,000, whether you are a volunteer or staff, we want to support, encourage, and equip you to lead well. So relax and listen to today's program.
Welcome to Group Talk. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Carolyn Takeda, your host and the Small Groups Pastor at Calvary Community Church in Westlake Village, California. Well, we all know that it's really important that we take time to care for our souls because we can only lead in healthy ways when we are in a healthy place. But it's so easy to get caught up with the demands of our ministry and life that we can end up neglecting our own spiritual health. And this is not only true for us as individuals, it's also often true for our ministry teams as well. So if you lead a staff team or volunteers or maybe a blend of both, you want to make sure that the people on the team are spiritually healthy, that they're refreshed and energized and at their best. And in order to have that, we need to be intentional and invest time and energy toward that goal. And a great tool that helps us with this is the group retreat. And summer, that we are now in June, is a great season to have one. So this month, we're focusing on team retreats. And we're going to do this in two parts. In the first part of the program, we'll be discussing why retreats are helpful, how to plan one, the whole process from developing a vision for what you want to accomplish, how much time you need, and the essential must-haves or the must-dos related to a successful retreat. And then on part two, we'll discuss specific tools and resources and tips on activities, really practically speaking, on what are effective things that will provide spaces where your leaders and your staff teams can be refreshed and energized. And so for this conversation, I am so excited to talk with my good friend, Amy Jackson. Amy, thanks for being on Group Talk.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So, well, Amy, your name is familiar to many of our listeners because you were formerly the editor at smallgroups.com from Christianity Today for many, many years. And you were part of the Small Group Network from our very early years. But she is now currently the founder and the director of The Perch, which is located in Aurora, Illinois. And The Perch provides space and skills for soul care, especially for church leaders. I know you specialize in church leaders.
Yes.
Is it because we have more need?
I think I just have a soft spot for the church leader because I've been there and I know how desperately I needed the soul care.
Yes, this is true. And so that's why I love your resources because they really do speak to kind of where we as point leaders live. Amy's passionate about helping people to live healthy, thriving lives of purpose. And she has a master's degree in Christian formation and ministry from Wheaton. So Amy, let's start off by defining what a retreat is and what it is not. And when we talk about a retreat, what are we referring to?
Yeah, great question. I'm so glad you brought it up because I feel like I've been hearing people use this term retreat very generously when maybe what they're really talking about is a development day or a leadership training day, which those are great things and really important for ministry as well. But I think when I think of a retreat day, I'm talking about something that it's actually going to leave me feeling a little refreshed and refilled and invested in a way that actually leave feeling better off than when I came in, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It's going to help me be encouraged to connect with God, connect with myself, and walk away a healthier, stronger leader. Yeah, and that may include some skill time. It may include some training or vision casting, but the primary focus is going to be on rest and refreshment.
It's kind of like a group Sabbath.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. I think, actually getting that time away to rest and be reminded of what's most important in ministry is so important for our leadership.
And do you think, since we call it a Sabbath, do you think it makes that much of a difference if, say, I go away, just me and Jesus, and we have our Sabbath versus I go away with a team, with our ministry team?
Yeah, I think both are so important, right? Going away by ourselves is so good, but I think there's something about coming together as a group and being reminded that we're part of something bigger than just us and Jesus. That's always a good thing to be reminded of. But also, I think there can be themes and topics that come out when we come together around, especially around a specific ministry like small groups, where we may begin to reflect on our leadership or our ministry or what we're doing and in new ways that we might not do just on our own. We might learn from one another or hear from one another and be inspired by one another in kind of some unique ways.
Yeah, and I think it also feeds into kind of the relationship building Not necessarily in a strategic, like development sort of ministry way, but more just the personal, interpersonal relationship building, because you get to hear a little bit more of people's stories and what God's doing with them, which then softens their hearts towards each other. So I think they're helpful for that unity, which then propels the strategic stuff that comes afterwards much more quickly.
Absolutely. I think one of the best things that can come out of a retreat day is that the people that are there feel seen and heard and valued just for who they are. And so I think that is huge for relationship building, and for unity, and for actually coming together around a shared purpose and shared mission. We feel like individuals and not just cogs in a wheel.
That's great. Yeah, that's a really good word. Seen, heard, and valued. That's really important. Okay, so I'm guilty of having done this where I fit too much into a quote retreat and I've mashed it. So I'll typically do, some things that are kind of soul care-ish, and then I'll throw in the strategic visioning thing at all. And I think over the years, I've learned it's just better to keep them a little bit separate. But I know I try to accomplish too much in too short of a time. And I think we're kind of guilty of that. So how do you help groups and staff teams or volunteer teams, to get clarity on what the purpose and vision of that time together is?
That's so good. And I'll just admit freely too that I am totally guilty of that. Oh my goodness. Like, how often do we get our whole team together, right? Or our whole ministry team or group? I mean, and so we're like, we got them together. We have to do all the things right now. So I think it comes from a good place. We want to maximize that time. We want people to feel like it was worthwhile. But what I often find is that ends up feeling like a whole mishmash of things that doesn't actually feel all that worthwhile.
Yes.
And it just kind of lacks clarity. And I know as an attender, I go to those types of events and then I leave and be like, okay, I'm not sure, and so
I've left those events and wondered, okay, this was too much of random things.
Yes. Also, I'm just like really optimistic about how much I can fit into a time amount. And so I feel like I always overplan. So one really good leadership skill that I have had to learn is cut whatever I think is possible in about half and then plan on that.
That's probably a really good practice.
Yeah, which, it's always, I think, for my own sanity, I always have a couple extra things that like we could do if the time allows. But what I almost always find is the half of what I think actually fits in that time is what fits a lot better.
Okay, that's a good tip. All right, so plan it and then cut it by half. How else do you work on clarity? There's some questions you ask yourself, or when you work with retreat teams, that you have them ask about what they're looking for.
Yeah. So I think, like I said, we go into them with such optimism and so much hope, and we have a million things that we could do. And honestly, I think it's first good to just acknowledge the things that you're thinking of are good things. And maybe you should do all of them with your team at some point, but probably not all in the same time frame. And so I always talk about, what is the one thing that if you walked away and only one thing got accomplished, what is that one thing that you would be proud to say, this was a success, this was accomplished? And that can be different for a lot of people. And even that's still pretty vague. It might be hard for you to narrow down. But that might get the wheels rolling a little bit. So what's that one thing that if it was the only thing that got done and you walked away from your retreat that you'd say, this was a success, we accomplished that one thing? Another way to kind of ask something similar is I would ask, what can't be done in any other setting? For instance, I think a lot of times we're tempted to do a lot of information sharing.
Yes.
Anytime our groups are together, our teams are together. And so we spend an amazing amount of time going over dates that are coming up, or a change in schedule, or where they can find a certain resource. And I always think, well, that could be done through email. That could be done on a handout as you leave that day. That could be done in a million different ways. And so what can only be done in that setting and can't be done in another way is another way to maybe start narrowing down.
That's a great question. And it really values the time of the people who are there. because they realize this matters because this could only happen with these people in this space and time. So that's really good. All right. So what are some ideal things to include if you're gathering your coaches and your, let's say not, and they can be volunteer or staff, and your staff team, that's responsible for the small groups ministry, and whether it's 3 people total or whether it's 30 people, what are some ideal things to include in that setting?
Yeah. So I always want to keep in front of my mind, and I said this earlier, but what are the things that will make people feel most seen and heard and valued? And so that comes down to the more relational things. So one big thing that I think is huge to include in a retreat setting is time for celebration or thanks, and specifically thanking leaders for things that they have done. Not only does that kind of bring us together in that unity, like you were talking about, where we feel like we're in this together, but it's also a genuine spiritual practice that we're called to celebrate.
Gratitude, yes.
Right? So what a great model that we can do that with our teams and show them what that's like. And it's a great way for people to actually, again, feel seen and heard. I've seen this done sometimes. I'll be at an event and I'll see leaders kind of say, go ahead and share at your table something that you think is going really well in your group. And that's okay. That's great. But I also feel like it puts us in an awkward position where we have to like toot our own horn and we're like, well, I did a really great job making this curriculum, or whatever. So it's kind of awkward, where I think in a retreat setting, I would love to see more and more people have either a coach or an upline or however you want to, whatever you phrase that person, to actually call out what's happening. So I could say, I just know Carolyn did this amazing job putting together this curriculum this semester, and this is how it impacted my group. And thank you so much, because I know the hours that you had to put into creating that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Amy.
But, I think that there's something meaningful about really intentionally thanking people, and not just the sweeping thank you for being a part of our ministry.
But to be really specific. Oh, it just reminded me. So last time our, when the small group network communications team, which is the bloggers and the podcast related things, and the social media team. So there's like a dozen or more now. We got together, actually, Derek, who oversees that team, he actually had some time, he opened with a time of, brag on each other. And so we, talked about somebody on that team, and we only see each other face to face once a year at most, but most of the time we interact via, email or phone calls. And so it was actually really sweet, because some of the specific things were things that you wouldn't have remembered about yourself. And there was just so much grace, and it just softened the floor for what came next, which is, okay, so what things are working, what things aren't working, which is a necessary conversation we need to have. But it was sweet. He took a chunk of time and had people affirm one another. And I think, that's great for small groups to do in general, but even on a staff team, I tend to think if they're at the coach level or above, that they kind of know. They know that they're doing a good job. And do they really, whereas when I meet with our small group leaders, I'm like, super effusive about thanking them, and a little less so with my staff team. So here's just a learning I'm just feeling very convicted by right here, is that I need to do more of that, or do that with one another in the way you're describing. And I think that would be very much an affirming exercise. So that's a must do. Okay, what are other must do's?
Yeah, I think another thing that can be really great during a retreat setting is time to honestly welcome and invite people to dream and brainstorm and contribute and give feedback for your ministry. I think sometimes we can get like really tactical with this and say we want 3 things about this particular thing. And that could be part of a retreat day. But I think kind of inviting your team into that larger vision and what's happening, again, not only kind of breeds more of that unity and helping people feel seen and heard and valued, but genuinely gives you great ideas.
True.
My only caution to this is I have seen people do this where they don't actually want the feedback. Like, they say, let's think about what can happen in the fall, but they've already got fall all planned out. And you can tell in how they respond to the, what's being given to them. There's a lot of like, oh yeah, okay, let's move on. And, not real honest, open, receiving of that feedback, maybe.
Right. So unless you genuinely want it, probably shouldn't ask for it.
Yes, maybe skip that over. But I think this can be a great place for that, especially if it's very focused on, dreaming about your ministry and what God's doing and how do we lean more into what he's doing here and what we're doing well. That can be very exciting and enlivening, but also refreshing where people kind of feel like they're part of it.
Right. Now, how do you feel about having an outside speaker versus not? I know people in small groups ministry have done it both ways. The kind of the comfort of having an outside speaker is that then you feel like you're a little off the hook. And whether it goes well or not is a little more dependent on this paid outside person. But at the same time, you lose a sense of control too about how things are going to go. So I don't know. Do you have an opinion about which is preferable in a staff retreat?
That's a great question. I think I've seen it done well both ways. So I want to just say that. Like, I think an outside speaker can be really helpful. But I think it depends on what our goals are for the day. I also think that we can be tempted to just kind of lean too much on that outside speaker and trust that they're going to figure it all out and trust that they're going to somehow hit all of our goals for the day, even though they have no idea what our goals are for the day. But I think a really wise way to bring in an outside person is to say, we really want to, for instance, I think a big part of a retreat should be time where your teammates can have time with God and connecting with God. And so maybe there's someone within your church that's in another ministry or an outside person that really has a skill or has some insight that can bring that and really bring something that you can't offer your ministry yourself.
That's good.
I think that's really helpful. Or if there's some type of training, I know we said not to lean heavily on training, but I think a little bit of training can be part of these days. And if there's some type of skill or some type of thing that you really want to help people understand, to bring in an outside speaker for that portion can be really, really helpful. So
just being really clear about what you want them to do. And accomplish. And I think, cost is often a factor with having an outside person. So sometimes it's doable to have someone internally that may, as you said, have a different skill set and can be good just to come along. And the nice thing about having someone, say, from the team or a volunteer, maybe a therapist or somebody who normally kind of is in your sphere that would do it as a ministry, is that then you as the leader can also relax and kind of be part of it rather than have to lead it, which I usually can't rest when I'm the one leading the thing. So I think that's actually a really nice gift to have when you can be part of it and kind of take that leader hat off. And that's possible if you have somebody else in charge.
Yes, absolutely. Which would also be a great argument for having someone come in to facilitate even a portion of your retreat, because then you get to kind of sit back and actually see what happens and be part of it rather than always be kind of leading and on for the day.
Right.
Well,
let's talk about how much time this requires. We already confessed that we try to fit in too much. So is this even doable in a half day, like 3-4 hours? Is it doable, Amy, or is that not?
No, that's a great question. I think it is. I think, but we have to be very realistic about what we can accomplish with that amount of time.
Okay.
So, for instance, I actually lead quarterly ministry leader retreats at the Perch, and we do 9 to 12:30. So that's a pretty short amount of time. But the only thing that we're accomplishing during that time is there's a very brief teaching at the beginning, 20 minutes tops, that kind of sets us up with a topic or theme. And the rest of the time is actually given to the leaders with lots of tools and ideas, but just given to them to spend with God, to connect with Him and to reflect. And so, for instance, our last one we did was focused on healthy leadership. So the teaching was on healthy leadership, and then all of the kind of optional activities that were laid out and given to people kind of centered around that theme. So there were different assessments you could do, or different prayer practices around that theme, or different Bible readings, or even just we are located near a river walking path. And so people got outside and just kind of reflected on what they were feeling God prompt them with. And so when you think about that, so a little bit of an opening, about 20 minutes of teaching, and the rest of the time was just theirs to be and to experience and reflect. And so I don't think if you have only 3.5 hours, you have to be realistic with
Right. With
what
what
all
you
you
can,
can
right, right.
accomplish. Um,
So maybe so if you had a full day, what would you
mhm.
add to that? So you would do that sort of thing for the first half, and then for the second half?
Yeah, great question. So I think when you have more time, you can do um, a mix of types of things. So you could have much more, you could actually have worship time where you're singing
Mm,
together as a team. You could have more group spiritual practice kind of things where you're doing more together. You can also maybe slip in a little more of like some specific training or time to brainstorm
right.
or that celebration time. I love doing retreats that have a natural division point. So what I mean by that is maybe the morning we spend kind of doing a little bit of group worship, a little bit of that brainstorming time, a little bit of teaching. We have lunch, and then the rest of the time is a shift where now you get to
Mm,
spend time by yourself or with a partner or whatever,
mm-hmm.
doing that reflective time. It helps kind of usher people into that reflective
Mm-hmm.
time more naturally. And
Right.
so I think that allows you to slip in some of those other things that we were talking about without feeling like you're overloading them with.
Right. And if you feel rushed, that kind of defeats the purpose of the thing.
Yes,
So you almost don't.
exactly.
And if you're going to do a full day, then it'd be nice to add dinner and kind of fun chill time at the end.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I love having time to debrief after
Mm,
activities to be able to say, okay, now let's come back together. What do you feel like God's saying to you? What's standing out to you?
mm.
Especially for those extroverted leaders,
That
especially
need
for
to
those people
talk.
who, yes, they need to talk. We love them, and we love those people. It's really important, and so to allow them some time too to put into words maybe what's been kind of percolating for
I
them.
love that because not only because I'm a verbal processor, but because I've been in places and events where things are like impactful, and then I get in a car and I drive, and then I'm kind of now swallowed up by my other obligations, and
Mhm.
there's without time to kind of synthesize and coalesce that into, into my thinking. So by actually building in the processing time after the exercise or after being apart, like you're much more likely to then remember it, and it feels a little more complete. Then it's like going to a conference and you have a conference book full of notes. But unless you've actually spent any time like processing it, I try to use the time like if I'm on a plane on the way back to because I know that once I get back, I'm just not going to have time to sit and reflect on all that. And so I love that idea of building it into the day. I think that seems like really good time well spent.
Yeah, and honestly, so I'm much more introverted, and so sometimes I'm always thinking like, well, how does this impact different types of leaders and different
Mm-hmm.
types of people? And even as an introvert, if I don't want to share a lot during that debrief time, even just hearing what other people are synthesizing and how it's hitting them can
Mm,
help me with my own synthesizing internally. So I think it's a really worthwhile practice,
right,
especially if we've done something as a group together,
right,
to then kind of close out that day with what's happening, what's
right.
going on here. Let's think this through.
Yeah, and that debriefing also gives you some common language to work around. So you launch into the ministry afterwards, and now when someone says you get some inside jokes, but there's just again a sense of unity, but some common language around this is what when we talk about this is what we mean, and now we've all kind of heard that, and it's kind of cool. All right, so let's talk logistics with our remaining time.
Yeah.
Where does the location matter?
Mm, this is such a good question. I have to say, one of my pet peeves is going to an event and realizing that the person has not thought at all about the environment. And obviously, this is my full-time gig, so I think about this a lot. But I think that the environment that we set up is huge, and that doesn't mean that it has to be expensive or fancy. But I think setting the tone. So as soon as you walk into the room, you know that this is going to be a
Mm,
time for you to be refreshed. And so things that we can do, I think one, getting off site is huge.
yeah, yeah,
Getting to just even another building or another place that
right,
you may not normally
right,
meet absolutely sets the tone for the day. I think making sure that there's plenty of space so people can spread out, they don't feel
mm,
overcrowded. Even thinking through like if you where you're sitting, if you're sitting around round tables or if you're sitting in desks or what that looks like. Desks automatically make us think
it's
that we're
true.
going to learn, right? So I knew someone, they were regularly renting a community college locally that they would rent some rooms for their kind of staff things, but you're sitting in like a classic college desk and then you're like, well, what? So yeah, so thinking about that, having comfortable things, I think even this sounds so simple, and is totally a small group tip in general, but having something for people to have in their hands. So having coffee or having tea or having cookies out or whatever it is, just helps you feel a little more, okay, I'm here, we can relax, and there's something I can do with my hands.
So we should think through the location, the environment. And you're right. It doesn't have to be expensive. It would be nice to be at a beautiful, place by the beach, but really even just, disrupting our routine by going to a different room that we normally don't meet in might be enough. So there's good options to think about there. And as far as, I said summer is a good time just because most small group ministries, at least in North America, we tend to take a little bit of a lull in the summer. So that's usually the planning season anyway for fall. So do you agree? Is summer a good time?
I do think it is. And I do think we have to have a little grace because obviously summer can be a busy time for families, for vacations, for a lot of other things. But I do think we naturally are taking a break. We already have some disruption to our schedule, to our routine. It naturally fits in with that. And and not to mention, the weather is usually nicer.
That's true for outdoors. I think it's nice to include some outdoor time somewhere.
Yes, absolutely.
And we've actually done it even in one of the congregation members' homes that's just nicer or has a nice yard or something. The idea is really that just to get away from our routine seems to be sufficient for that. But yes, the weather, I didn't even think about the weather. See, we're in California. We just don't have to worry about that part of it a whole lot. And then finally, who to include? What's your thought on this? Does it work to mix staff and volunteers? Is there a certain number that we shouldn't exceed for good dynamics? What are your thoughts?
That's great. I think, you can easily do a retreat with everybody, right? Like your staff, your coaches, your individual leaders. So I think it goes back to those questions around what are we trying to accomplish? What is the goal here of the day? I think if we really want to make individual group leaders feel loved and cherished and, that this is important, we want to, invest in them, kind of narrowing it just to those leaders is really important. So that the coaches then can be investing in them or doing those celebration things or whatever. But I also think there's real value, and we cannot forget to do things that are just the staff team, just that kind of core team, because like you said before, I think we easily get into we're the ones always putting on the things for everyone else.
Right.
And we really, really have to remember to take that time for ourselves. And sometimes we need that time by ourselves, not with all of the leaders, so that we can actually be honest about what's going on or struggles or it's a different dynamic when you're a maybe full-time or even part-time staff person versus just a volunteer at night. So
that's a really good point to consider. Not just what do you want out of the retreat, but also who do you want around the table that would facilitate that reaction. And I think it depends too, like the staff thing for sure. Like say your church has gone through a season of transition, or you have a lot of new staff, or you just need some time together. So that's a good time just to have staff, or you've onboarded a whole bunch of new coaches and they need to bond with one another. So it'd be good to just be intentional instead of just automatically wanting to, maximize again everyone and everything, to be intentional about who needs to be in the room for that to happen. So I love that. So those are some of the logistics, and this will conclude our part 1, Amy. So in part 2, we'll talk about more specifically about practical tools and resources that you can use during that retreat time together. Thank you so much for listening to Group Talk, and we will see you next time.
Thank you so much to Carolyn and Amy for a great part 1. We're really looking forward to part 2, and it's always a treat having Amy on the podcast with us. Now, before we go, let's talk about Accelerate. Accelerate the health and growth of your small group ministry by attending one of our Accelerate small group workshops. These workshops can be found all over the country and are designed to help you and your leadership team build a 12 to 16-month strategic plan for your small group ministry by going through the 20 questions every small group point person needs to know. You will finish the workshop with a strategic plan in hand, and here are a few Accelerate highlights. Accelerate DC is coming up August 5th through the 7th, and there are less than 5 spots left. Accelerate Ohio is coming up September 16th through the 18th, and early bird price ends June 26th. And finally, Accelerate Atlanta is coming up October 21st and the 22nd, and the super early bird price ends June 26th. Make sure you visit smallgroupnetwork.com/events to register today. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you later on this month.
Thank you for listening to Group Talk. We invite you to subscribe to the podcast through iTunes and get new episodes downloaded automatically. Also, if you enjoy this program, please take a few minutes to give us a positive rating on iTunes so that other small group point people can find us more easily. We encourage you to visit our website at smallgroupnetwork.com to access our library of free resources, connect to a huddle with other small group ministry leaders in your area, read our blog articles, or join us on our Facebook group. Don't forget to use the hashtag SGNet when engaging with your social media channels. Thank you for your support.